All right, it is 1:29. We are right on schedule. Are we rolling?
You're broadcasting to the world.
Hello, world.
Including the food recommendations.
Now they want to come in.
Yes.
And Josh is standing by ready to
Okay,
start.
so welcome back. Our next speaker have just met on Zoom on this camera just a few minutes ago, but we've had a lot of good email exchanges. He's got a lot of personality. He's fun. I think you're really going to like him. His name is Josh Gelly, and he's an evangelist of the Church of Jesus Christ, headquartered in Monongahela, Pennsylvania. And I was introduced to Josh from Jim and Patrick McKay, who've been here the 2 previous years. They said, you need to get a hold of Josh, and he'd do a great job speaking. So we will turn the time over to Josh Gelly.
Bear with me one moment, folks, while we get things set. Good, Cameron? You getting the screen now? All righty. Excuse me. Welcome, Josh.
Can he see us?
No, he can't see you, but there's a room full of people here that are watching you on the big screen, Josh. We're delighted to welcome you. Let's do a quick sound check. Go ahead and say hello.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. Adrian, you just give me the thumbs up, and I'll get rolling. It's wonderful to see everybody today. I wish I could be there in person. Much.
Go right ahead, Josh. We are going.
Awesome. Well, greetings, everybody. My name is Josh Gailey, and I'm evangelist of the Church of Jesus Christ, headquartered in, however it gets pronounced, Pennsylvania. And we're an international church through the Restoration that's established in over 20 countries. I think the number right now is 23. And we've had a great growth curve across the world, especially over the last, if you take 20-year chunks, we've probably doubled in our membership growth over those windows for a nice stretch. So it is just such a blessing to be with you. I wish I could be there in person. And I just wanted to, if I was there in person, I would totally be showing off my beautiful wife and my fully toddler son, Josiah. And so I wanted to start off with a picture and show you my family. And so the Church of Jesus Christ, we are passionate for the Book of Mormon. We're passionate for the Restoration. And actually a surprising thing that we're the second largest organization that has the Book of Mormon as part of our doctrine and accepts as the Word of God. And so I say that with joy and love. I know that as we look at the Restoration together today and celebrate the first vision, the thing that comes to my mind is in the first recording from 1828 from Joseph Smith, when he talks about the first vision, he doesn't even mention the Father. He just describes this power of the light that comes in front of him, that emanates from upon him in that moment as he escapes the darkness. And that miracle that's the inception for each of us of our faith, and it's the bedrock of who we are as the people of God. I just celebrate that with you today, and I can't think of a better way to celebrate 200 years than to be with a group of saints that love the Lord and love the Restoration. I do run a podcast and a website where I interview scholars on the historicity of the Book of Mormon. I just finished one with Professor Hilton on Monday, and it'll go live next week. And so you can access that at bookofmormonhistory.com. I certainly welcome anybody to join us on what brings us together with the Book of Mormon. Today we're going to be looking at the evidences for our faith that come from the 2 founding miracles for us, the resurrection of Jesus Christ and the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. and how that is such a foundation for us in our life and what we can learn from. And this research is not my research. What I'm doing is I'm taking the best evidences from apologetic scholars on the resurrection of Christ. That includes N.T. Wright out of Oxford, William Lane Craig, Gary Habermas, and others. And I look at their minimalist arguments, their minimalist points on the historicity of the resurrection of Christ. And then I use that, I lay it on as the base, and then over top of that, I overlay the restoration story. And I say, okay, if this is the platform to study a miracle, I'm not creating the platform, but if this is, how does the Book of Mormon, how does the restoration stand up against that backdrop? And if together we can look at that, my goal today with you is that we would put one stone on our wall of faith to fortify us against the enemy of our souls together. So we're going to be looking at the evidences for the resurrection of Christ and comparing that to the restoration story. We certainly live in a world of skeptics today. I'll give you a skeptic on the left and a skeptic on the right for both miracles that I'm purporting. The one on the left says, if anyone had any real evidence that indeed Jesus did return from the dead, then that is the beginning of a dropping of a series of dominoes that takes us to all kinds of wonderful things. Now, I'm not going to ask you who gave that quote. I'll go ahead and give it away, but I hope you don't have a subscription to his magazine, because this is Hugh Hefner, and he's the founder of Playboy magazine. And when he was interviewed by Lee Strobel, about Jesus Christ, this was his quote. And what he was basically saying is, you should hear the sarcasm coming out of the quote. If we had any real evidence that indeed Jesus did return from the dead. Now, apologetic scholars would raise their hands and say, well, have you looked at the evidence? Okay. Same with the Book of Mormon, of course. Same with the Book of Mormon. Here's a quote on the right. If the evidence is with the Mormons or the Book of Mormon, fine. I think it's very clear that the Book of Mormon case is highly problematic on the basis of the evidence alone. And I'm actually quoting there somebody I really, truly respect. And that is Gary Habermas out of Liberty University, where my cousin's going to be going to in the fall. And Liberty University is one of the premier Christian universities in the country. And here is one of their believing scholars. And I would make the same claim. I'm going to use Gary Habermas's material today. I respect him as a scholar. I don't think he has seriously looked at the evidences for the Book of Mormon. I think that if he did, he might be surprised at our discussion today if he were to listen in. So the first step for us in looking at these two activating events, these two miracles, is to look at the reliability of our sources. All right. So as we look at the reliability of our sources, we're going to take a look at first the Gospels and the New Testament sources that we have. And compare that, give some sort of historical backdrop for that. So what I want to do first is give you Alexander the Great. Let's look at the point of Alexander the Great's death, and we will call that ground zero. And then let's look at the earliest written source for Alexander the Great. All right, so Alexander the Great, one of the most famous emperors, conquered Macedonia, expanded the empire of Macedonia, the Grecian Empire, throughout the known world, greater than any previous empire before it. And so one of the most famous figures in all of history. You can't go through sixth grade world history without learning about Alexander the Great. And yet the earliest written source for Alexander the Great is almost 350 years after ground zero, after he died. Okay, that's the earliest written source. We obviously have archaeology of the cities he built, but as far as an early written source, we're 350 years away. The next best source is all the way 400 years after he died. And so when we think about history, we have to keep that in mind when we look at the reliability of our sources and where we're getting our information. And again, this is a minimalist argument. We don't sit around a Sunday school and look at this stuff, but this is a perspective that we should have, definitely when addressing somebody that might be a critic or somebody that we're introducing the gospel to for the first time. And so when we look at somebody that's contemporary for Jesus, Tiberius Caesar, who was a Caesar of Rome, during Jesus' own lifetime. We have one source that is contemporary to Tiberius, and one of his generals writes briefly about him right at the time period he was living. But then the next best source, and actually the best source on Tiberius Caesar, comes plus 80 after Tiberius dies. 80 years after, and this is a Caesar of Rome. Now, when we start looking at the Gospels, the Gospel of John is the latest Gospel that's written. And again, I'm using a minimalist argument, which means I'm using critics' dates, not my dates or not a believer's date. I'm using a critical date on when the Gospel of John was written. And it's written at 90 AD, which would be roughly, if I'm just using round numbers, plus 60 from our activating event, plus 60. Mark is supposed to be written around 70 AD. So now we're at plus 40 from our activating event. Right there off the bat, we have sources that are already better than some of the best and most famous people that have ever lived. Now you get into 1 Corinthians, we're plus 25 after Jesus' death of when Corinthians is written. Within 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 7, you have a section where Paul says, I give unto you that which was first delivered unto me. And then he starts this pattern of da-da-da-da-da-da. And in that, I want you to take a little note to go to 1 Corinthians 15 today at some point and read verses 3 through 7. Paul is quoting something. He's saying, I received this message. And if we start tying in the timeline, he would have received that message when he went to Jerusalem after his conversion, which means that now we're at plus 3 to plus 5 of a testimony of Christ and his resurrection. We're within 3 to 5 years of the activating event. Remarkable, considering that Jesus was a carpenter and nobody on the world history scale until Christianity takes off. And yet, when we look at the reliability of our sources, if Paul learns that at plus 3 to plus 5, well, if he learned it, that means it already existed, which means that phrase that he was quoting was already extant. It was already there. And so now we trace ourselves back. We are right at the moment. We find ourselves at the tomb with Mary and Mary. We are so close with our written sources for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Very reliable sources that we have just within the text itself, not to mention outside texts that we have, which we'll get to in a moment. Now, how about the Book of Mormon? A historical artifact that we have. In fact, I have here with me this version that I had to buy when I realized I was hopefully coming out, and next year, hopefully I can and meet you all in person. But the stick of Joseph in the hand of Ephraim, the Book of Mormon, the Nephite record that we have, we are at ground zero as a historical artifact. Not only do we have copies of the 1830 print of the Book of Mormon, we have the printer's manuscript in Oliver Cowdery's hand. We have the original manuscript. 28% of the original manuscript exists. Thank God. And we have it and we can study it. And when we study the 28% that we have, we know who's writing it based on their handwriting as a scribe and what they're writing about and the different verses that we have. So here's some images from the Critical Text Project that Royal Skousen has overseen out of BYU. In fact, some of this research was even used reciprocally with some of the work of the Dead Sea Scrolls and uncovering ancient manuscripts. So there's the jigsaw puzzle of the part of the original manuscript that the Critical Text Project had to go through. And my main point with this is we're out at ground zero so we can study it. Let me give an example of how that works to study it to maybe enhance our faith. There's a portion of scripture in the Book of Mormon where the word coriantumr comes up the first time. And in the original manuscript, which we have this portion, it's Oliver Cowdery writing. And when Oliver Cowdery's writing, it's his handwriting, and he writes out coriantumr exactly how we would phonetically sound, with an ER at the end. The problem is coriantumr is not written how it sounds. And so you have coriantumr crossed out phonetically how it sounds, and you have in all caps Oliver writing letter by letter coriantumr. And at the end, at the final R, he just flourishes the final R at the end. And it's almost like you can get this personality of Oliver saying, how did you possibly expect me to be able to spell this right on the first go. But when you study that out, what you're actually seeing is somebody is reading that text aloud, dictating it. Oliver is using his ears, listening to the dictation, and writing down on the original manuscript Coriantumr as it sounds the first time. Then crossing it out as he back checks his source, letter by letter, writing out the correct translation, which means the Book of Mormon from the original manuscript, when we study that text, it shows that the way we know from the witnesses, including Oliver himself, when they describe the translation process, Joseph Smith receives a portion, he reads it aloud, the scribe hears it, writes it, reads it back. If it's okay, they go on. If it's not okay, they make a correction and then move on. That's exactly what we find when we study the original manuscript. So the reliability of our sources, when we look at both the New Testament examples of the resurrection of Christ and the Book of Mormon, are extremely reliable for us to learn from. So today we're going to go through 4 points, and I have to fly because of time here. But we're going to go through 4 points for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. These are minimalist facts that even non-believing scholars would agree with, and then we'll draw our conclusion from those things. Jesus was killed by crucifixion, point 1. Point 2, Jesus' disciples believed he rose from the dead and appeared to them. Point 3, there are skeptics that convert. And point 4, Jesus' tomb was empty. 4 historical facts anybody could agree on for when talking about early Christianity. The historical fact of point 1, that Jesus was killed by crucifixion, is attested not just our reliable sources in the New Testament, but I have 4 listed here of extra biblical sources that talk about the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, that historical event. Tacitus, I'll just quote him real quick here, was a Roman historian, and we could read any one of these, but he says, Christus, or Christ, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty. The extreme penalty would be crucifixion for a Roman. So Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hand of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus, and a most mischievous superstition. And then he goes on and begins to describe the early Christian movement. But there is an example of a non-biblical source, an early source, talking about the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. And we have several of them, including Josephus and others. Point 2, witnesses. There are disciples that believe Jesus rose from the dead. Okay, we certainly get that out of the Gospels and out of the New Testament. Some of the early writings of 1 Corinthians 15, which we already touched on. But also what I want to bring out is there were early apostolic fathers, okay, that talk about the disciples that mentored them. Clement of Rome, Polycarp, Ignatius. When they talk about the disciples, they talk about how those disciples were willing to die for something they had seen. Now, that's different when you look at that from a lot of martyrs in the world. So somebody from jihad might be willing to blow themselves up for something that they believe in, but they're not blowing themselves up for something they've actually seen. They're blowing it up for a belief. We have soldiers today, in a good way, that are willing to die and sacrifice themselves for our country, and we enjoy that freedom. But there's a difference between that and somebody that witnesses something and then is willing to go to their death because of what they believe and suffer persecution because of what they had seen themselves as an eyewitness. And that's the comment we get from the early apostolic fathers is, hey, Peter, who mentored me, he was willing to die for what he had seen. And I'm so convicted by that testimony that's why I'm leading this section of the church today. That's the feeling we get from some of these early writings from some of the early church fathers. So the apostles are willing to die for their faith, and not just for their faith, for something that they had actually seen, die for their witness. So we have the historical fact of the crucifixion. We have the historical fact that the early disciples suffered and died for what they had seen and knew was true. And we also just quickly, I think we could all agree to this, that James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul and others were very skeptical. In fact, some even Saul's, before his name was changed to Paul, was persecuted the early church before his conversion. And so their remarkable conversions are used as an argument for the resurrection of Christ. And then the last point, which we'll get to at the end, is the empty tomb itself. Now let's take those first three and lay them over the restoration story and see how they compare and see how they line up together when we parallel them side by side. So the evidences for the restoration. Point number one, the historical fact, we have a Book of Mormon. Anybody that wants to give an account for this has to answer all the scholarship that's out there, all the work that's been done on the Book of Mormon and its historicity, and also needs to give an alternative theory that gives a better explanation of the facts, of the fact that we have this text. Point two, witnesses believe, they suffer, and they're even martyred for what they believe, and we'll go into that. Skeptics do convert to the movement, and I have one or two really important examples that we'll look at. And point four, in New York, at the top of the hill in Palmyra, there was an empty stone box in New York, and we have multiple people that testify to the fact that there was an empty stone box in New York. After the church moves to Kirtland, and really there's no members left in New York, the hill was still there. The empty stone box was still there for anybody to see. So those are our four fundamental facts, parallels side by side, as evidences the resurrection and the restoration. So the historical artifact of the Book of Mormon, we've talked about the reliability already, and we've talked about historical sources. The fact of the matter is, you can go to the print house today. There's a beautiful museum in Palmyra. The Book of Mormon was printed. We have the manuscripts. It is a historical artifact. We have it today. What we need are the ability to account for that artifact. So the factual evidence of the Book of Mormon is something that we have to examine for ourselves. When we go to the witnesses for the Book of Mormon, I love to compare and contrast these. We have the ones that we know well, right? The three witnesses that received an angelic visitation are shown the plates, turn the pages, satisfy themselves in actually two experiences of two, because Joseph Smith was there. So it's really a testimony of four if you include Joseph Smith on that day. And so you have their experience, and it's very supernatural. And it's a blessing to read their witness that starts off many versions of the Book of Mormon, certainly ours at the Church of Jesus Christ. Then you have the testimony of the 8 witnesses. And when you read interviews from John Whitmer and some of the others, you start getting it was just Joseph Smith came out and in 2 groups of 4 handed them they passed around the plates, they turned the pages enough to satisfy them, and then they give descriptions that all are very close in what they had seen, even though they're being interviewed across distance and miles, yet there's a consistency in their testimony of what they had seen and bore record to. And so here what's beautiful is we have the spiritual witness and we have the natural witness both together. And if you include Joseph Smith in that, you have a number 12, which is a beautiful number to have as far as witnesses go. And all of these witnesses stayed true to their testimonies and never denied them in the face of persecution until their death. We have over 200 different accounts separate from the Book of Mormon account of 3 witnesses giving their testimony in different interviews in different places. And we have over 60 accounts of the testimony of the 8 witnesses. So certainly a lot of parallels there that we can draw from when we consider these points side by side. I'll just give one from Martin Harris that I love. Martin Harris, when he was a little bit older and was being interviewed, he was the oldest of the 3 witnesses, but also lived a long time. He was in Kirtland for many, many, many years before he went back out to Utah. He says, "Young man, you see that sun shining through that window. Just so sure as that sun shines and gives us light by day, and the moon and the stars give us light by night, just so sure I know the Book of Mormon is true. For I saw the angel, I heard the voice, I saw and handled the plates upon which the Book of Mormon was written, and by the power and influence of the Holy Ghost, the translation was made by the prophet Joseph Smith, whom I know by the power and gift of the Holy Ghost was a true prophet of God. Amen. And just as a note, as far as 3 witnesses go on Martin, there's somebody that mortgaged his farm to fund the printing. There's no real evidence that he ever got paid back for that, although we assume he did. And then Kirtland, he never joins the anti-bank in Kirtland. This is really the point of friction for Martin. And so as the church goes and the church essentially leaves Martin and goes to Missouri, the one thing he holds true on is his testimony and his witness to the Book of Mormon, even though he suffered financially at its printing and suffered loss. So Oliver Cowdery, I wrote with one pen the entire Book of Mormon, save a few pages, as it fell from the lips of the prophet Joseph, as he translated it by the gift and power of God, by the means of the Urim and Thummim, or as it is called by the book, holy interpreters. I beheld with my eyes and handled with my hands the gold plates from which it was transcribed. I also saw with my eyes and handled with my hands the holy interpreters. That book is true. It contains the everlasting gospel, and came forth to the children of men in fulfillment of the revelations of John, where he says he saw an angel come with the everlasting gospel to preach to every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. It contains principles of salvation, and if you, my hearers, will walk by its light and obey its precepts, you will be saved with an everlasting salvation in the kingdom of God. Powerful words from a powerful testimony. Just give one example from the 8, and then we'll talk about their persecutions. I have to kind of alternate here, but he was being interviewed, and he asked if he had seen the plates. John Whitmer, he says, "It is so, and that testimony is true." "Did you handle the plates with your hands?" "I did so." "Then they were a material substance?" "Yes, material as anything can be." "They were heavy to lift?" "Yes, and you know gold is a heavy metal. They were very heavy." "How big were the leaves?" "So far as I can recollect, 8 by 6 or 7 inches." "Were the leaves thick?" "Yes, just so thick that the characters could be engraven on both sides." "How were the leaves joined together?" "In 3 rings, each one in the shape of a D with a straight line towards the center." "In what place did you see the plates?" "In Joseph Smith's house. He had them there." "Did you see them covered with a cloth?" "No. We handled them uncovered into our hands, and we turned the leaves sufficient to satisfy us." Many examples we could draw from. That's a few of their testimonies. Now let's line up what they went through side by side. Many of those early witnesses suffered bankruptcy, especially with the anti-bank in Kirtland. Some of them experienced rejection, complete rejection from their family and friends, people they'd grown up with and known their entire lives. They were cast out by society. Those of you that are from Independence originally know some of those experiences more than I could possibly describe from some of that history that's there. They were imprisoned, and they were rejected by their own culture and religion. They were excommunicated, and here's the point for the 3 witnesses that certainly bears true. All 3 were excommunicated at one point in time from the very church that they helped to found. And even if, so at that point, if there's a fraud going on, at that point, that is the time to stand up and say, "Let me tell you what really happened." None of them did. Their responses in those moments of persecution from their own church, they respond, and they might not say something terribly nice about an individual, but when it comes to the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, they always stay true to their testimony. And they say, "I know it came forth by the gift and power of God. I saw it for myself." And some of them, including Joseph and Hira, were martyred. They had seen and bore that witness to the very end. And we praise God for that witness and that example in our life. There are skeptical conversions to the movement. And I want to give an example here that's on the board. You see Josiah Stoll as we compare these side by side. Josiah was actually somebody, and this can be a criticism, but Josiah helped fund Joseph Smith as a money digger. This was Josiah Stoll's investment that he makes in Joseph early on, when Joseph was a young man. So Josiah Stoll was somebody that never reaped a financial return from that investment, even though he was funding the money digging that Joseph participated in. So if there was anybody that should not have joined the movement, it would be something that never got a financial return when they were asking Joseph to do that search to divine out treasure. And so instead, we get the exact opposite. Josiah, what happens to him is really unique, and this is something that's only been found within the last years. Not only does he convert to the movement and join the church as somebody that should have been a skeptic on the outside based on the history and the past that he had, but he was actually home the day that Joseph brought the plates from the log into the house for the first time. When Joseph first gets the plates, he doesn't take them home right away. He sticks them in a log and goes home. When he does take them home for the first time and he passes it through the window, Josiah Stoll was at the house, and the frock that was covering, the cloth that was covering the plates lifted up a little bit, and Josiah was just able to peek and see the edge of the plates accidentally. But under court, when Josiah was being interviewed by a court of law to testify against Joseph Smith, he surprised the entire crowd and testified for Joseph Smith, and under oath said, I've actually seen these for myself, and let me tell you how and where, and let me describe what I saw to you. And the court records have been uncovered of Josiah Stoll's testimony of him accidentally seeing the plates for himself. An unlikely skeptical conversion and an unlikely witness when it comes to the Book of Mormon plates. The final point for the restoration here is the empty tomb. And I know I'm cruising really fast here, so thank you everybody for sticking with me as we have our running shoes on right now. But the empty tomb, there's 3 points scholars will make, and it's summarized with Jet, J, Jerusalem, E stands for enemies, and T stands for testimonies. And I'll give those examples. J, Jerusalem. Where does Christianity start? Jerusalem. How far is Jerusalem from the tomb? It's there, right? It's there. Depending on where you want to argue the city walls are, it's a brisk walk. Okay, so you could walk to the empty tomb from Jerusalem, and within days of the resurrection, Peter is standing at the temple on the day of Pentecost, and he is preaching, and he's standing on the streets and he's preaching, and the gospel begins in power in that moment with their declaration from the day of Pentecost as we read Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 3. The problem with that, if you're a skeptic, is the movement starts exactly where the activating event happens. Everybody that was there would have known of the crucifixion, and everybody that's there would have certainly, because Joseph of Arimathea was a Sanhedrin, you could have easily gone and seen for yourself the tomb. And so if Peter is preaching, there has to be an empty tomb, because the easy way to dismiss Peter and end the movement would simply say, his body's right here, let me show you. But there wasn't a body. The tomb was empty. Jerusalem. Enemies, how do the enemies respond to this? They respond with an admission of the empty tomb. In Matthew 28, when we look at that, how do the Sanhedrin respond? How do the Jewish leaders respond? They say, the disciples came by night and stole away the body. So the best thing the enemies had against the church was, yeah, the tomb's empty. We have to give a counter explanation. The enemy's earliest example was an admission of the empty tomb itself in Matthew 28, as we look at the 12th through the 15th verses there from our Point 4, and I would like all the sisters in the audience to hold the tomatoes, please. Point 4 is unlikely testimonies. And thank God our world has progressed a little bit from this, but in Jerusalem, and you can see this in the Talmud, and you can read about it in Josephus. I'll read you Josephus's quote, okay? Josephus talking about women being a testimony in a court of law. He says, this is Josephus writing. Josephus was a Jewish Roman historian. Okay? He was a Jew by birth. He was a Roman by trade. It says, let not the testimony of women be admitted on account of the levity and boldness of their sex, nor let servants be admitted to give testimony on account of the ignobility of their soul, since it is probable that they may not speak truth either out of hope of gain or fear of punishment. And in the Talmud, it even says that a robber is more qualified to give the same testimony and evidence than a woman. So that is the cultural backdrop of Jerusalem at the time period of Christ's death and resurrection, that a woman's testimony wasn't even allowed in a court of law historically. And yet, when we look at the gospel accounts, who were the first witnesses of the resurrection? The women, Mary and Mary. They were the witnesses, or they were the apostles to the apostles, if you want to look at it that way from the meaning of the word. All right, so the women were the first testimonies of the risen Christ, which is unlikely if you're making up a story of how this happened. So the fact that the women are admitted to as the first witnesses is an unlikely testimony that the historical data that we're receiving is accurate, that it really was Mary and Mary at the tomb. Okay, let's compare this side by side. When we look at the evidences for the Book of Mormon, we go from jet to pet and lay it on top. So Palmyra is the P on, so we're looking now, we looked at the evidences for the empty tomb. We're now overlaying that for the evidences of a hill in New York that had a stone box on top of it that was empty because Joseph had recovered plates out of that hill. Well, the Book of Mormon is printed in Palmyra, which is a brisk walk away from the hill. So the restoration begins at the point of the activating event. So if you want to go see for yourself, you could walk from downtown Palmyra and reach the hill. You know, my wife and I were just there a year or two ago for the pageant. It takes about a minute in a car. So it's a 1 mile walk directly from the print site. So just like Jerusalem was the beginning of the movement, and it starts right at the activating event, we see the same thing occurring in the restoration. If you wanted to know, if you were in Palmyra, if Joseph really did receive something, go to the hill and see for yourself. Which leads us to point 2, enemies. Joseph testifies about this when he says, the most strenuous exertions were used to get the plates from me. And we know from enemies of the early gospel, including Willard Chase and others, they admit that the hill had an empty stone box, and they're trying to recover and fight for and threaten the Smiths. So the early enemies of the church are not standing up and saying, Joseph, he's a fool. He's never found anything in his life, and he certainly hasn't found anything now. That's not what they're saying in Palmyra in 1830. What they're saying is, Joseph has something, and we're going to get it. He should cut us in on the profit. So the other money diggers that are around know that there's an empty stone box. They believe Joseph's recovered something from that stone box, and their goal is to steal it and get it for themselves. All right. It even goes, when we go to this topic, David Whitmer's first experience with the Book of Mormon is interesting. He's on a train coming into Palmyra. This is certainly starting to swirl that Joseph had received something, and a group of men are talking about it on the train. And David tells him, he says, how do you know that this person has received something? Why would you believe it? Do you even think it's true? And these men on the train say, we know Joseph's received something. We don't know what, but we've been to the hill and we've seen the empty stone box. The testimony from an enemy made David Whitmer compelled to meet Joseph Smith for the first time. That is a remarkable evidence for the authenticity of the history of this event as we find it. So we have many unlikely testimonies at the end. And if we just want to draw women to women, because actually in the early 1800s, a women's testimony was not on the same par as a man's in a court of law. So we could even go there, and we have all these written testimonies of Lucy Smith and Emma Smith and Joseph's sister Catherine talking about moving the plates from table to table, talking about cleaning the upstairs room and those things. And the plates were right there, barely covered, and they give that description. And so Emma, for example, and I think for the sake of time, I'm probably at the tail end here, she says that the plates often lay on the table without any attempt at concealment, wrapped in a linen tablecloth. She says, which I had given him to fold them in. I once felt the plates as they thus lay on the table, tracing their outline and their shape. They seemed to be pliable like thick paper and would rustle with a metallic sound when the edges were moved by the thumb, as one does sometimes thumb the edges of a book. Joseph Smith, or the edges of a Kindle. Joseph Smith could neither write nor dictate a coherent and well-worded letter, let alone dictate a book like the Book of Mormon. And though I was an active participant in the scenes that transpired and was present during the translation of the plates and had cognizance of things as they transpired, it is marvelous to me, a marvel and a wonder, so much as to anyone else. That's Joseph's wife. So in conclusion, as we've looked at these evidences side by side, I know our testimony is not built or founded upon evidences. I know our testimony is built and founded upon the Spirit of God, delivering us an answer of His truth, revealed to us in latter-day glory. I know that's the foundation of your testimony as well, as it is. But I would pray that today a brick has been put on the wall of your faith, that you would stand against the enemy when he tries to fire and dismiss God's work in the latter days, that we might be united as the people of God, endeavoring to bring forth His promises, because the greatest witness of the resurrection of Jesus Christ isn't found in one of the Gospels. The greatest witness to the resurrection of Jesus Christ is found in 3 Nephi, the 11th chapter, the 15th through the 17th verses of our versification of this. And I'm sorry for what chapter or verse that might be for you, but you'll recognize the words when it says, and when they had all gone forth. This is the Temple Bountiful. This is when Christ descends at the Temple Bountiful. It says, when they had all gone forth and had witnessed for themselves, they did cry out with one voice. 2,500, probably men, which means at least 5,000 plus children that He blesses, cry out with one accord, saying, Hosanna, blessed be the name of the Most High God. And they did fall at the feet of Jesus and did witness, worship Him. So the Bible gives us maybe 500. The Book of Mormon gives us maybe 5,000 as a witness to the resurrection of Christ. And so I would say to you today that the miracle of the resurrection is my compass. It points me, and there's two spindles usually to a compass. One is to get your bearings, and the other is to give you your path. And I would say that Jesus Christ gives me my foundational bearings for my faith. And I would say the Book of Mormon gives my path and hope for the future. And both miracles are essential in my walk with the Lord. And we are all witnesses today through the Spirit of these marvelous miracles in our life. And you are witness today of God's marvelous work in these the latter days. So may God bless you. It's been my privilege to listen in all morning and privilege to participate. I can't wait until hopefully maybe next year I could be with you in person, even if it's just to be there with you. And I say that in the love of Christ, and just thank you for your time today. God bless you, and thank you for letting me, and thank you for letting the Church of Jesus Christ have a seat today at the table in sharing these blessings together of the Book of Mormon and that first vision, that foundational miracle from Joseph Smith, from the Lord on high. May God bless you today.
Josh, thank you on behalf of all of us. Thank you so much for your testimony, for the witnesses that you've shared, and for a very convincing and well put together presentation. I think that the legal profession has suffered for not having you as a lawyer. That was very well done. So
I'd be the one suffering if I was a lawyer, I'll tell you that.
All righty. Well, thank you. We'll sign off now. Hopefully, you'll be watching the rest. And
I will.
All
Thank
righty.
you. Thanks, Adrian. God bless everybody.
God bless you as well. Goodbye.
Yes, that was very enjoyable, Josh. Thank you for teaching us. Really good information.